Oh, right, we're back. What do we want to talk about now, Adam?
Welcome back, everybody. Okay, I have a nice, like, broad, generic question for you. So, what would you say, as a GM, is your biggest influence?
Ooh, biggest influence.
Yeah, what
Gee.
influences you most as a GM when you're like creating stuff for games?
I mean, generally, like the broad category would be stuff I read.
Yeah,
Definitely.
books.
Yep.
Yeah.
Books in general. Um, for the West Marches specifically, there's tons of like fairy tales that I've like. I've always loved fairy tales. Like when I went to college, I got like an anthology of fairy tales, and I just started reading through them and being really interested in how different they were from what I expected. Because like growing up on like Disney and sort of like the fairy tales that people are told nowadays, um, like I didn't expect them to be so strange and arbitrary. Like fairy tales
Mm.
are super arbitrary.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah. You don't get to know what the rules are. Things just
yes,
happen.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Have you seen just as a digression? Have you seen any of the like really terrible like fairy tale role playing games that exist? There are several, and they're all bad.
no,
Yeah, there's like a couple of D20 ones. Like if you just look up the word grim and role playing game, there are
yeah,
a few, and they're all kind of like D&D but with fairy tale stuff.
yeah, that's a shame.
It's an underappreciated genre. I mean, obviously, if anyone in chat has a better game that does that, well, let us know because I'm
Hmm.
curious. Um,
What's your biggest influence, Adam?
Music, like, yeah, across the board, music is the first thing that I go to when I'm trying to get my head in a place for a game.
Mm,
Um, and it's almost never like what you would expect. Like I could point to a couple of albums that basically make up the soundtrack in my head for all of the games that I'm playing or
nice.
running, or like even like Dungeon World. Dungeon World in my brain when I think about it is made up of Warp Riders by the Sword, the first Wu Tang album, um, Celestial Lineage by Wolves in the Throne Room, and that most recent the National album. So I mean,
Hmm.
two of those are metal, but one is like a concept album about science fiction. So for me, it's about like we were talking about before, about getting to the like essence of a thing and kind of absorbing it aesthetically and then
Yeah,
regurgitating it as game stuff.
yeah.
And sometimes it's just about capturing like a moment. And other times it's like broad sweeping thematic stuff. And so the first thing usually I do when I come up with a campaign is like look through my music that I have and try to think about stuff that might be appropriate to get my gears going on any given kind of trope or tone.
Nice.
Um,
Music is a big thing for me too. Like
yeah.
listening to it, like it's not sort of the first thing I go to, which is funny since I studied it in school. But I think to a certain extent, my studies do inform like the sorts of fantasy that I like and sort of like things that I pull imagery from a lot, like the songs that I used to sing when I was younger and things like that. And then also just like putting my brain in the right mood,
Yeah.
like that music helps a ton just for getting and like tapping into the mood of what I'm looking for. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, yeah, looking like I can draw direct correlations as to why, like, I don't know, "Ante Up" by Mashout Posse is such a good song for playing Dungeons and Dragons too,
Mm,
you know. But people don't usually make that connection. Like, there's a lot of cross cultural bleed between like heavy metal and fantasy more so than there would be like gangster rap in Dungeons and
yeah.
Dragons. But
Yeah.
it's more about finding inspiration kind of wherever it comes, and like what we were talking about before. And yeah, it's easy to do the genre thing, but you and I were talking about this earlier about interpreting things above and beyond the surface level for inspiration, like how when people play like Vampire the Masquerade for the first time, they're going to run it, they're like, well, I should go watch like Interview with a Vampire, and I should watch Lost Boys, and I should watch like all these vampire movies. I should watch Dracula. There's all these people with fangs in them. I should watch Blade.
Yeah.
But all of that stuff, the only thing it has in common is people with fangs, and it's not like you said, like House of Cards is a way better vampire TV show than Lost Boys is for
Yeah.
vampire, right? Because the you scrape off all the surface stuff. You scrape off like the White House and the political stuff, and you scrape off the sharp teeth and the drinking blood. And the game and the show are about the same stuff. Um,
Power
so
and influence.
yeah, exactly. Getting what you want by any means or within a certain like moral code, and like how far will you go to test your morals to get the things that you need. So I think that like for me, every good role playing game, every really good role playing game that I've read has where they wear their influence on their sleeve. Like a lot of games, Burning Wheel does an awesome job of this. Eclipse Phase also a fantastic job. White Wolf Games is one thing they did well. They make it really clear and obvious the things that inspired them to make the game. Sometimes going so far as to say like, here are the albums we listened to when we made this. Here are the books you could read if you're interested in what inspired us to do this.
Yeah.
And it's not always just stuff from the same genre. It's things that share a culture of design.
I appreciate that a lot whenever I get a game and it has like a real obvious sort of references list, because that's the other thing that, especially for like R&D, that's the other thing that I find incredibly valuable for putting my mind into that space. Looking at the art, listening to the music it talks about, and reading the books. Huge.
Well, John Harper's games do this cool thing where he's started to include like if this show or if this game were an HBO series, this would be the title music.
Nice.
So like, and it's in the same way that HBO does. It's almost never like here's it's a fantasy game, so here's like a sweeping orchestral piece from the Dragon Age soundtrack. It's like it's a fantasy game, so here's a Neko Case song, right? Or like, here's a New Pornographer's song, and it's like you listen to the song, and it's not, the lyrics aren't about the same thing, the instruments aren't of the era, but it imparts a certain sense of cinematicness to the game that you might otherwise like miss out on, right? So I think that from that perspective, looking at other pieces of media above and beyond the genre and really delving into what they're about at their core or what they evoke emotionally can be hugely awesomely useful. Like I love it as a GM when I find a song that I'm like, awesome, this is perfect for this thing in like Swan Song or whatever. And I almost feel like that'd be a really fun experiment to do. Like we should go aside and like find like 10 songs, like find 10 songs for the West Marches, and I'll find 10 like songs for Swan Song, and we can just like post a list on the subreddit.
Yeah.
Like, here's your soundtrack for this.
That would be cool. Is it like for the show or for a specific episode?
It could be both. I would go with like the show overall, like the aesthetic we're going for. I think that'd be really fun. Let's totally do that.
All right. It's done. The pact is made.
Okay. Cool.
So you included a specific phrase here.
Yeah. So I don't know where I picked this up from, but there's this tool that you can use when you're playing a game, and it can drill down. It can be like, the game is like this, or it can be like this NPC or this place or whatever. So it's like X, but Y, right? Mm-hmm. So like this can be really broad. So you could be like, it's like Dune, but Paul Muad'Dib never came to Arrakis, right? Like the Harkonnens got him before. So you're like playing, down and out Fremen trying to fight off the Harkonnens alone, and your Messiah never comes, right? Or you could describe a character. You could say like, he's like Bubbles from The Wire, but he's a cyborg, right? So you can mix and match stuff to make things more genre, or take away stuff you don't like about the character. I mean, you could be like, it's like Lord of the Rings, but not sexist. Right? So that's a phrase. So it's like X but Y, where if you have an inspiration that you like and you're not really sure how you want to deconstruct it, you can literally describe characters like that and say, it's like this character, but different in this way. Or it's like this character in this way.
It's like Trailer Park Boys in the post-apocalypse.
Yeah, right? Bam. Like, I know what that campaign is going to feel like. And like, it's such a useful phrase. Or you can use it's like X and Y, or like X with Y, right? So you can be like, it's like Lord of the Rings, or it's like Lord of the Rings and like Islamic folklore. So it's got orcs and elves and stuff, but also it's got like jinn and Allah, right? Yeah. And then it's up to you as a group to figure out how it's like those things together. And I feel like I can do it's like X but Y for like every NPC I've ever used in a game. Like if you watch Swan Song, Wu is like Short Round, but not racist. Yeah. Well, not a stereotype. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's like, it's one of my favorite tools, and you can use it. I brought it up in this episode particularly because so often you're having to describe genre as, like a different thing. Like the game is like this, but like not like that, or it's like this, but like that.
Yep. Or like, just those genre expectations. I mean, just clarifying. It's, it's Warhammer 40,000, but focusing on the horrors of the Imperium.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's lots of cool stuff you can do with that phrase. So put that one on a note card and put it in your GM coat and save it for later.
Absolutely. So I want to talk about inspiration for the games that we're running right now.
Yeah, let's do it.
Where do you pull for Swansong? So
Swansong has, it's drifted a little bit from my original intent for it, which I think like when I originally started it was a little more focused on, it was a little darker. It was a little more like not to the point of being like space horror, but like the vast loneliness of space and like a little more atmospheric in that way. But I think that there's still some of that. For me, the big visual aesthetic, like when I envision scenes in Swansong, and I try to get this through in my description of places and landscapes especially, I still imagine like 70s hard rock album covers. Like Yes album covers. I imagine like Blue Oyster Cult album covers. Like that aesthetic for me. Anything Sid Mead has ever drawn, airbrushed spaceships, like totally unscientific but really interesting looking stuff. Have you seen Jodorowsky's Dune? Have you seen that movie?
I haven't seen it.
Oh my god, it's so good.
I need to.
It's good for lots of reasons because Jodorowsky's like an insane person and really fun and like a driven genius and really fun to watch him talk. But for me, the stuff that really appeals is the art, the like things that went into. I think Dan O'Bannon did a lot of it. The like concept art that would have been the movie. So these huge garishly painted spaceships and like weird kind of alien looking backgrounds. That stuff for me is a huge influence on Swansong, and because role-playing is an oral medium, I have to impart that through speech, right? I have to be like, you see a spaceship and it looks like this, and like this is a lot easier gap to jump now that we have the internet, but I can be like, it looks like this, and I can say, here's 12 JPEGs that it looks kind of like. Just mush those together in your head. But in other places, I try to leave it unclear, right? I try to say, like, I've never like picked a picture of it and said, this is the Swansong, right? I've never been like, this is the layout of the Swansong. Like, I describe stuff vaguely on purpose to, like, let the audience and let the players kind of reinterpret that.
One of the things that I love about that is actually that, like, there's been, like, 8 or 10 drawings of the Swansong from completely different people, and all of them look right to me. They all look like the Swansong somehow, and none of them is definitely the Swansong, but all of them are the Swansong.
Yeah. And I refuse to canonize any given Swansong. Like, you can interpret it yourself within the aesthetic that I'm trying to establish in the game. Obviously, in terms of like visual stuff, it gets to be this gets to be a truer and truer thing about Swansong as we go through episodes, but like philosophy in general, particularly like Cartesian philosophy, and I think we're going to see more of the varieties of that stuff is a big influence on the game, and obviously like classic sci-fi like Alien, Blade Runner, Dune, whatever, like any given like 70s or 80s like sci-fi. And one thing that actually just sort of occurs to me now that's really starting to come up in the game, the imagery and kind of like inherent meaning behind tarot is like a big thing that's kind of coming up in Swansong. There have been a few people who've picked up on it in the subreddit, but it's definitely a thing that you'll see more of as we move through that universe.
Cool.
Yeah, so a lot of varied stuff, but also like it's still within a general universe, right? You could place Swansong in a culture of other sci-fi based on some of the things that are or aren't included or the ways that certain things get described.
Awesome. Yeah, for me, for the West Marches, like it all came out of my love for fairy tales. So like, especially Russian fairy tales, because like Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen.
Russian fairy tales don't fuck around.
Yep, yeah. Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen are super cool, and when you read like the actual fairy tales, they're much more complex and much weirder. Like they're I read someone talking about something like about the weird and how there's sort of this aesthetic that exists in some media where it's like there's sort of a lack of understanding as to why things happen and a sort of a confusion as to whether or not it's morally motivated or just motivated by something completely different. And I get a very strong sense of that out of fairy tales in general, where like, in Russian fairy tales, I was just reading one like 2 weeks ago, where like, there's two brothers or two neighbors or something like that, and one of them is just a complete dick to the other one, and so the other one goes off and has good fortune, and he comes back, and the one is like, hey, give me that stuff, and this one is like, okay, hop in this sack. And the guy hops in the bag and he slings him over his shoulder and he throws him in the river and drowns him.
Yeah, fuck that guy.
And that's a good thing in the moral compass of this story. It's like he was nice in the beginning, so he got great stuff, and then he also got to murder the guy who was mean to him.
Yeah, he got to murder his enemy.
Yeah,
straight up. So, I think that like you're doing this really good. You're doing a really good job in West Marches of imparting, like, speaking as a player, of imparting that sense of not fully understanding the world around you, of like things happening and being like, why? What did I do to deserve this? Like what?
I know exactly what you're thinking about. And the fun thing, part of on my side is no. Well, part of the fun on my side is coming up with the reasons for it, but also knowing that when the players interact with it the first time, they won't necessarily know. But then later they still have the opportunity to actually do the work of sort of like investigating it more and engaging with it and exposing themselves to it further in order to start piecing it together and being like, oh, okay, so there's this other thing going on here? Wait, why is that the way
So do you feel like that fairy tale aesthetic is a thing? Like, because you and I didn't talk about this before I played West Marches. Like, is that a thing that you feel like you imparted like explicitly, or that you just want to come out and play?
What do you mean? Sorry, clarify a little bit.
Like the idea of like, because I feel like if you were to say to me like, okay, this game is based generally in some loose aesthetic way on Russian fairy tales, it would change the way that I played my character within it. We talked a little bit about it being like, mythic Russia or whatever, and that's why Dr. Grigori is the way that he is.
Yeah.
But like, I definitely know that I'm gonna, if I play again, which I'm sure I will because I have a quest that I need to go on. Yeah. Give me some magic ointment. I'm gonna approach things very differently now. Like I'm gonna trust or not trust certain types of NPCs different ways. I'm gonna see signs where maybe I wouldn't have before. Yeah. Like there's that genre expectation. Like before, when I was playing D&D, I want to go on this quest in a certain way, and I'm looking for D&D ways out of it. But now I know all I need is like 3 magic beans, and I need to find a witch to make a deal with. Yep. Like, so I feel like in a way, do you feel like at what point are you gonna need to start hacking Dungeons and Dragons to fit that aesthetic? Like, I feel like the game is fighting you in a couple of ways.
It is, actually. Totally. And I think it's fighting me on 2 levels. I think, to a certain extent, I feel like it's fighting me on the West Marches side of things.
Yeah.
Because, like, 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons has backgrounds, and some of them do automatic things that basically break the feeling of the West Marches as an interesting way of engaging with a world. Like the Outlander background, that just means you memorize locations, and then you don't have to navigate to them anymore. And then also similarly, like, the fact that it's also focused on battling things. I mean, like when you were playing the session and you ran into the sick people, and it was like, well, I feel like we should kill them just so we get experience points.
Right.
Yeah. And to a certain extent, I have already started hacking a little bit in that, like, when you choose an objective, you go out and you conquer it, it basically counts as achieving a hard encounter for giving you experience value. But it's worth also talking more about, so maybe in the future we'll have to, like, bounce ideas off of each other, Adam. But
I mean, it's hard for me because I'm just going to try and tell you to make the game more like a way that I can get more experience.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a good example of using a game that because you have to apply that game to a baseline experience of players, right? Because you're guaranteed to have players that know more about 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons than you are to have players that are familiar with Russian fairy tales.
Yes.
So you do have to apply that baseline game experience, and I think that that's sort of the natural progression, is you play a game that doesn't necessarily fit, and then you watch it bend itself towards a certain type of play by way of the mechanisms.
Yeah. So really quickly, I just wanted to like throw this in you guys' ears. My two other references for the West Marches are like historical fantasy rather than traditional Dungeons and Dragons, like Forgotten Realms stuff. Like everything that feels Forgotten Realmsy, I just want to tear it out of the West Marches and throw it away. And like go back to some other Dungeons and Dragons game.
So what about like yeah, what are you excising? Like what traditional fantasy traditional like what's D&D stuff are you going to try and excise?
Well, like for example, like a bunch of like a small group of people have been really good about like maintaining the West Marches wiki. And one time, players ran into like I think an owlbear or something, and they started categorizing all of the monsters that they'd seen so far, and they drew like the descriptions and pictures and everything straight from the 5th edition sort of source books and put them on the West Marches wiki. And I have specifically, goblins are not goblins.
Right.
They are goblins, and they're like strange fey creatures that sort of have agency, but not really. And primarily, they only exist to go devour children from their cradles.
Yeah.
And like, they don't really use weapons, and they don't really organize in like groups that have religions and have like philosophies and whatever. They're kind of they're just boogeymen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like I don't really have orcs in the way that traditional Dungeons and Dragons has orcs, and like in certain D&D games there's this sort of struggle over these other intelligent and organized creatures are evil. Are they all evil? What is that about? Like, why is it like that? Is it fair to kill them? I've killed all of these orcs. Here is a group of baby orcs. How do I feel about that? Like,
yeah.
There probably are no baby goblins in the West Marches. They're just goblins because they're boogeymen.
Yeah, and I think, based on like what you're saying, it sounds to me like you're already doing kind of the first stage in hacking a game to make it fit an aesthetic or make it fit a type of play, and that you're like subtractive hacking is always the easiest place to start, right? To say like, these are the things I don't like. Let's throw those away. Yeah, and like, what do we have left? And that's where you start from.
And the third thing that I pulled a lot from for the West Marches is French and German art song, because I went through school and I sang a ton of French and German art song, and like a song like Der Erlkönig is like, that's basically where the White King came from, guys. So if you haven't gone and listened to Der Erlkönig, like, there was just a song about an elf king. He had a mother who had like long golden hair. He had daughters who were waiting to dance with this kid that he was going to steal away forever. Like, I just said, okay, here are the things that I'm going to put in the game. Done. Bah! Awesome. And then like the sort of, there's this timeless aesthetic from French and German art songs, like these moments of crystal clarity that are locked in the performance for all eternity. And like when I go to describe a scene in the West Marches, that's sort of the aesthetic that I'm trying to bring across. Like, what is the water like? What birds are singing?
So here's a challenge that I watched you come up against. What do you do when you have a really well-defined aesthetic in your head about like the somber entropy of the Elf King's lair, and you're participating in that scene with a PC named Vajgert?
Oh my god!
Like, what do you do? Like this is the question about how do you enforce aesthetic via players, right? Like, because I think a lot of your players are just playing D&D, and it's like beer and pretzels D&D, and not like engaging the setting in a meaningful way.
This was actually really surprising to me. Is in that like I kind of offered them in the beginning. I was like, well, you guys could go to the Barrows. I said to Lal Renene, I said, of an elven ruin that hasn't been fully explored yet. It's to the northeast of town. And then as I saw the way they were engaging with each other and how they were actually fairly engaged with like messing with people, messing with each other, and like engaging rather than like disengaging, I said, okay, I think this other thing I've prepared actually will work for them. So I started introducing it, and sort of like they started playing with it and got really hyped up in like, oh god, how can we avoid this terrible thing happening? Like almost from a metagamey perspective of, I know this game has to exist outside of us, so how can we not fuck it up for everybody who comes after us? And then they kept playing with it, and I felt like as I treated the world as a real thing, and especially as a thing with a consistent tone, then they all started really engaging with that as well, especially when it got into the very sort of horror elements of like, there's this creepy sort of sinuous hair climbing all over the walls.
Well,
what do you do because this could kill you?
Yeah, I mean, I really want to tangent here because you mentioned a thing that I think is nearly impossible to do, and definitely impossible to do as it stands in a online game with less experienced players. Horror gaming, like playing a horror game. In my experience, it's nearly impossible to play a game that feels scary, because when people get put on the spot, they go silly, right? Where they're like, I'm not really sure what to do, so I want to try and make people laugh because that'll break the tension and I won't feel uncomfortable. And that's what makes horror gaming so difficult. Like,
yeah,
I can't think of very many games that genre-wise that make it easier for you or make it even possible to play a horror game outside of a bunch of people who are incredibly dedicated to creeping each other out.
Well, the funny thing is, like, when we got to that section, when they were in the White King's realm, I felt like they had enough silliness, and I'd split them all up, and I said, okay, here's a problem. It's for you. How are you dealing with it? Then all of a sudden, all of them really went, oh, man, like, how can I do, what is going on here? And it just kind of worked. And maybe it worked because I had separated them out, and maybe it worked because they had gotten enough silliness out of their systems earlier. But by the time we got into the White King's realm, I think they also felt like all of a sudden they had real agency, and they were able to do things that made interesting choices for themselves as players, for their characters, and for the world as well. Like, by then they had sort of like, they'd opened the White King's, muzzle and unleashed him on the West Marches, and they were like, whoa, what just happened?
I mean, I think that tension is possible, but that horror is very difficult. Because I think that in a game where you're playing a character and your character might die and you might lose the effort that you've put in to the game, that's like, tension is possible and fairly easy in a game where the stakes are set at a certain level. But to actually create like fear or that sense of like that it matters, like you're scared not just because your character might die, but that you're scared of like what's going on. That's a really hard feeling to engineer in your players.
Yep, I definitely agree.
Yeah, something that's a challenge I personally have not. Like, I just kind of avoid horror games just for that reason. Because most games, like game mechanics don't support it very well, because you get tension, you get die roll tension, but like horror is a thing that comes from it's so hard to mechanize that.
Well, I think what is it? What I heard someone say once, is it terror is the fear of the known and horror is the fear of the unknown? Or I think it's vice versa. Terror is the fear of the unknown. Like, okay, I'm in here, there's something bad and it's going to eat me and I have no idea what it is or where it is or anything. I'm terrified. But, I am watching Hannibal Lecter, cut open a person and extract their liver so that he can eat it. I am horrified.
Yeah, you're horrified because you don't know why this is happening.
Right.
There's a book, speaking of influences, there's a book that I read that really like changed a lot of the way that I look at that exact thing, that like Lovecraftian like fear of the unknown, like philosophically what it is to not be able to know a thing. The book is called In the Dust of This Planet, and it's fucking awesome, and it's only like 120 pages long. Check it out. If you're interested in like horror and philosophy, it's super cool. It's a really good book.
In the Dust of This Planet.
In the Dust of This Planet, yeah.
Awesome. I think another reason that like horror and fear in general are hard to manage in a game is because those emotions aren't gamified. Like, when you're dealing with a system, even if it's a system based on probability, it feels like something that you can learn, master, and then exert control over. Yeah. And totally. I think that the feeling of being scared is ultimately one where you have no control.
Yeah, which is hard in role-playing games, because role-playing games are all about contributing. Honestly, I feel like, and this is a unique element of... this is a totally unique element of playing games with an audience, is that I feel like it's way easier for me to invoke fear in the audience than it is in the players, because the players have control and the audience has to watch their favorite characters die.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's like this completely different thing. And I think it's really interesting. It's like an emergent property of playing in this different sphere.
Interesting.
Cool.
Now I'm trying to think of like
It's like
how
trying
you
to find it
could.
back. See what we were
Yeah,
talking about before.
I'm now trying to think about like what kind of a situation would you need at the table in order to feel like players have lost control and you're putting them into a scary situation. Like,
It's
what would
tricky.
that even
Yeah.
look like? There are other types of role playing that are based around basically that entire question.
Yeah.
Yes. So, tell me about Mirror Shades.
So Mirror Shades, I think this one, I mean, it wears its influences most obviously on its sleeve because, it, unlike Swan Song, like where in Swan Song, I randomly generated the universe and I had an aesthetic in mind to apply on top of that universe. And it's really easy for me because the game is all about tags, right? But Mirror Shades has a genre already. It has nested subgenres. Like, we're not playing a cyberpunk game. We're playing Shadowrun, which is a very specific type
Mm.
of the cyberpunk game, and it has its own feeling. And there have been a few moments during the game so far that feel very Shadowrun, right, where you see that clash of magic and technology, and like an elf summoning a dove spirit while their friends are getting shot at by a corporate security sniper, and someone's like got their cybernetic arms, like they're ripping off a truck door, and like there's elements of it that feel like we're being adherent to that. So what I'm really doing more is finding influences within that and seeing how I can paint the things that I have as influences with the Shadowrun brush rather than the other way around, right? Like, Shadowrun is the palette, and the things that I'm including as plot elements or story elements, they're getting painted into that Shadowrun color set.
Mm.
So for me, like, the biggest thing, the aesthetic is kind of like 80s action movies. Like, the NPCs all kind of act a little over the top. People are a bit more archetypal in this, which gives me some freedom to be counter archetypal, right? Where I can say like, like she's like an orc, but also she's just like a really sensitive lady and like a person, right? Rather than just be like, yeah, like all the orcs are tough people and all the trolls are tough and all the elves are not tough, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I'm leveraging the influence inversely than maybe I normally would. And the biggest influence on this, aside from like the stuff that's built into Shadowrun, because you can't get away from like Stevenson and Sterling and Gibson, like you can't. It's built in, right? It's the game is as much an homage to that stuff as it is anything else.
Yeah.
So for me, the big influence is just like stuff that's going on now, right? Because that's what sci-fi is about. It's about exploring shit that's important now through the view of a different thing. And there's a lot of that in Swansong too, but it's more philosophical and sort of highfalutin in Swansong.
Hmm.
In Mirror Shades, it's very literally like, this is shit that's important today, right now, in the space that we're all occupying. So taking things from current events and mixing and matching them and making a new thing, and then painting it in Shadowrun colors and presenting it as this question, right? As being like able to say, this is a thing you might recognize from reality, and how are we going to interact with it under these circumstances in fiction, right? So for me, it's less about the influence, and I guess this is a thing where you can kind of see science fiction working its magic and taking interpretation from things that aren't media, from things that are just real life. Yeah, so I mean that's kind of my thing.
I've been thinking about that a little bit with West Marches as well. Like, I really enjoy the philosophical moments in Swan Song, and like, I hear you're getting some of that from Mirror Shades as well. And
Mirror Shades is, I would say that Swan Song is philosophical and Mirror Shades is political.
okay,
Like that would be how
Yeah.
I would describe the two of them.
and like, starting to sort of think about like in the umbrella of a one shot where maybe some characters we'll never see again and some characters we'll see fairly regularly, like, how could I possibly move people into that kind of experience and engagement with the world and with characters while still staying true to sort of the core of what West Marches is about? So, interesting challenge to think about.
I mean, I think ultimately it just boils down to like what space do fairy tales take up in the society that created them? Like, they're about enforcing behavior, right? Like,
Yep.
fairy tales are stories told to get people to act a certain way. They're like religion in that regard, where it's like you tell kids the story of Hansel and Gretel so they don't wander off into the woods or take food from strangers.
Yep, totally.
And it's painted to look like a story about witches and magic and whatever, but it's like, don't do this. You know, you teach the story of like, don't be a dick to someone because their life might get great. They might come back, put you in a
And
sack,
throw
and
you
drown.
in the river. Yep.
Yeah, don't
Absolutely.
be an asshole, or motherfucker will drown you.
Yep.
So, you know, I mean, I think that's a way you can do it. Is that they're all very moralizing, and I think if the players buy in, you can instill a sense of that from both sides, right? Like you can let, like I would be totally cool with being like having Grigori be like the bad guy in those stories where it's just like, you know, don't be mean to the creepy doctor, or don't let the creepy doctor touch you or you will die, right? Or bad stuff will happen to you. And like the players can be both sides of that kind of morality play, because really we're all acting stuff out for, again, like for the audience, right? So don't think about the players necessarily as like they're the participants in the fairy tale, but the fairy tale is told to the wee little children of chat, so they'll learn their lesson about what is and isn't right to do in the world of West Marches.
Yeah. Right? There's also something about like how being like there's basically two ends for adventurers in the West Marches, and I'm peeling back the curtain in a big way here, right? Like either you go adventuring and you die because you are not supposed to go out into the wilds. It's a dangerous place. There's horrible things. You don't know the rules, and you're gonna fuck it up, and then you're gonna die. Or you become really strange. And you become really strange in the ways that, like, the people of civilization are not comfortable with. You come back with leprosy, or you become pregnant with a demon baby child, or, like, who knows what else is going to happen to the characters who go out adventuring regularly.
And what I think is really interesting is that we've managed completely organically and by accident to come full circle on the topic, because you know, this whole episode has been about exerting influence, and we've talked about how media exerts influence on games, but what we're talking about now is how games exert influence on the people that play and consume them, right?
Yeah.
Is that like, how do you come out of a game? What does the game do to influence your thought patterns and behavior outside of it once you leave? Like when the people that I play Mirror Shades with, when they've had a particularly intense episode, you know, how do they see the world around them differently, right? How are they perceiving other people's race differently because the game is about that? Or like, I think a lot about someone asked me this on Reddit about how I use NPCs and like who I choose to make them close to. And particularly there's an NPC, and I won't spoil it, but there's an NPC in Swan Song who's particularly close to Wheat's character. And they asked me like why I chose this NPC to sort of focus on Piani. And I said, you know, well, there are a few in-story things, but mostly it's because the character is fairly childlike, and I know that Wheat has a kid, and he talks about his kid a lot, and obviously cares about him, and I want to see how Wheat, as a player, is influenced by and influences that NPC and how their character behaves. So I think a lot of that stuff that goes into a game, like the players all put this stuff in, but you take something away from the narrative when you leave the table, right? And the game influences you as a person. And it might be something just as minor as like you think about one little thing some different way, or it may really change the way that you think about something because you have, you know, a different idea about the world because you've explored it in a role-playing game.
Now I'm really excited to see Kurthak x Juliet tomorrow.
Yeah, right? Like...
Awesome. Okay.
This is totally a thing. Like, people engage in role-playing games to varying degrees, but yeah.
Yeah. So before we move on to Q&A, which we should do very, very shortly here, I want to talk about Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor.
Yes. Yeah, totally.
So we've made like a list of general useful stuff and good examples of genre games, and like games that I think are really good genre games. Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine is a great game about being a Space Marine. It's awesome. You just like run around and blow shit up.
People complain about it being too simple, but being a Space Marine is about one thing. Just
simplest thing in the world. You don't have
killing the shit out of stuff.
Yep, absolutely. And then Darkest Dungeon. Awesome genre game. Like it just feels so impactful and like tense, and like as you're going through the dungeon you feel like, oh, there's no right decision, what do I do? Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor. Great game. Love that game. Horrible Lord of the Rings game.
Yeah. So Shadows of Mordor is like exactly what happens when a bunch of gamers get together and like, all right guys, I want to play a Lord of the Rings game. And everyone's like, yeah, okay, what do we want to use to play Lord of the Rings? And someone's like, Assassin's Creed.
Yes. I want to torture orcs.
Yeah, or like Batman, like Arkham Asylum. Like, cool, yeah. Okay, so I'm like a brooding like angry white guy, and I'm a loner, and I have like a dark spirit, and I like go around murdering people, and it's awesome. And
Yep.
and it's like Tolkien. That's not. It's totally a great game,
Yep.
but it's not. It's not a good example of Lord of the Rings.
Well, like when you look at a game like oh God, what's the Lord of the Rings RPG called? The One Ring.
Yep.
The One Ring does so much to try and bring in this idea that the people of the good side of the world, like they really are good in all of the way they express themselves. They don't want to murder and torture orcs. They don't want to kill Gollum. They don't want to do these things because that's not what good people do. That's what, the Dark Lord and his people do. So, like, for me, playing the One Ring feels very, very Lord of the Rings in the way that
it's all about journeys and all that stuff. Yeah,
and sort of like your struggle with the shadow, like that's a big element.
Yeah.
But in Middle Earth: Shadow of Mordor, like you don't struggle with the shadow.
Yeah.
You are the shadow. You are the one who knocks.
It's the 90s superhero, like it's got to be grimdark and like brooding and like put your hood up, everybody, because it's time to murder some suckers. And like it's a fun game for what it is, but yeah, it does very much feel like a deviation. And honestly, like I think that this is the thing, you can explore facets of a setting using the wrong game in a fun way if you're willing to take some risks with it. You know, like you can do the grimdark Lord of the Rings if you want to. Just don't adhere to the canon setting too hard, and play around with it. Like be a little bit like tempted to just mess stuff up, because occasionally you'll get a Shadow of Mordor, which it's a thing.
I mean, I feel like to a certain extent, Shadow of Mordor, like it takes its hands off of the setting well enough in the way that it uses the Nemesis system, actually, because primarily the stuff that you're caring about in game is all of the emergent story coming from the Nemesis system, and you're hunting down these orc captains that they have no place in the Lord of the Rings story or universe.
Like I would love to be in a position to have a role-playing game, to use as an example here, that's like it's a licensed game and it does a different thing than you might expect and it's really good, but they're all terrible if they do that. Like the best that we've gotten, because the life cycle of the money, I guess the life cycle is longer, but the money that's gone into role-playing games isn't enough that we've had the ability to develop an expensive IP in a way that does something new or interesting. Everything is just about trying to emulate what already exists, and for the most part it's pretty terrible.
Yep. All right, so I think we should do some Q&A. So if you have a question about genre or influences or where to get inspiration from or how to distill inspiration into creative output, put them in chat. Generally, guys, we steer away from answering questions that are not closely related to the topic of the show. So if you have a burning question, feel free to head over to r/beingeverythingelse and drop that in there.
Yeah, get your Reddit on, because we'll always follow up.
Absolutely.
Those threads. Yeah.
Do.
Yeah. Now we let chat catch up.
Someone's asking if we've ever looked into playing Everyone is John.
I
haven't.
I see that game. Like I feel like I just need to look at it because everyone talks about it. I think it's one of those things that's like really popular on Reddit and nowhere else on Earth.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
I've read about it and I am curious about it. But I've never played it.
I have a good question. Weezawell asks, how do you find time to consume the amount of media you seem to?
Yeah, that's good.
Our answers are going to be really different.
Go for it.
Quit your job. Quit your job, read books, play Monster Hunter, stream video games. It's difficult. So yeah, like I mean, I think that it's less about absorbing more stuff and more about getting more out of what you absorb. For me,
yes.
It's about picking the right stuff.
Yeah, that's a great answer. For me, like I'm sort of getting inspiration from anywhere. Like everything that I read, everything that I watch, I'm sort of looking at. Like I think I just caught like a glimpse of the episode of Doctor Who with the Ood.
Mhm.
which was like a sort of a hive mind sort of mining colony people or whatever, and that inspired like almost the entire Numenera session that I did with Jesse over on R&D.
Yeah.
Just because like I just saw it on TV once, like months before we ran that show, and then it came back. It just like popped into my head once. I was like, oh, we should sort of explore a little bit more about what it means to, tackle people that are involved in sort of a weird hive mind like that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. So yeah, let's try taking some more questions of these. I really I'm interested in this question from Zikoticus. Do you guys feel like you run into genre limiting systems more, or the other way around, systems limiting genre?
A good game really hammers down genre and doesn't let you like screw around with it too much, and has a very clear idea of what genre the game is when they wrote it.
I think, yeah, like I don't ever feel like the system. Well, yeah, I if I choose the wrong genre for running in the system that I'm playing, I feel like the system is limiting me in my ability to reach that genre's full expectation. But when they're working together well, it works really well. And I never really feel like the genre limits the system to a certain extent, because like I expect the system to reach to the genre, not the other way around. Like it's the game designer's job to create a game that gets to the genre, rather than it's the genre's job to, you know, make the game work from that perspective.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. So Ace Newland asks, how important do you think character creation and backstory is to genre expectation and sticking to them? Character creation is huge. It's so huge because you're telling people what they can or can't be, right? You're saying, like, in this game, these are the things you can play. Backstory is an illusion. Like, backstory is a thing that somehow Dungeons and Dragons made up, and you like have to have it before you play. Backstory can emerge just as you play. I think it's borderline irrelevant, but character creation, because it's a mechanic in the system, it's you have to have it adhere to genre. Because if you're playing a game about samurai and the game allows you to be samurai, a Shinto priest, a Buddhist monk, and a foreign devil, it's not a game about samurai anymore. It's a game about a bunch of other bullshit.
Yeah.
So yes, huge. Look at the character creation setting. Look at that, like, almost immediately when you look at a book, and it's going to tell you what kinds of people populate the universe that you're going to play in. So yeah, big deal.
I really like this one. Maybe we can just go through it super quickly.
Okay.
Nico Nell is asking, can you guys just say a few good book series about sci-fi or medieval fantasy? He or she is asking,
Yes.
just because they've never found really good series, though they're currently reading Wheel of Time. My heart bleeds for you, Nico Nell, because the Wheel of
You're
Time,
reading Wheel of Time.
it's not a good series. No, it's fine. It's enjoyable enough. Though there's so much good fantasy out there. I'm like in book 7 of what's it called? Malazan Book of the Fallen. Very great by Steven Erikson. I loved Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun. I love everything that Jack Vance wrote in the Tales of the Dying Earth.
Fucking yes, Jack Vance is the shit.
Yep. I really like picaresque stories. So like I really liked Don Quixote, just because it's so quick and interesting, and stuff keeps changing all the time. It's really fun for me. The Great Book of Amber by Robert Zelazny. Roger?
Rogers.
Yeah. Roger Zelazny.
R.
Fantastic.
Zelazny.
Yes. Lord of the Rings, of course. Adam?
I'm gonna throw 3 sci-fi series at you right now. The Expanse series. I think they're on like book 3 or 4 right now. Super good hard sci-fi. Kick ass. The Southern Reach trilogy. Super creepy, like modern sci-fi. Reminds me a lot of Roadside Picnic, also a good book but not a series. And the Imperial Raj series. It's only 2 books in, but Ancillary Justice and Ancillary Sword, both super good sci-fi books. So go and read.
There's another one that I actually really liked, even though it's not commonly spoken about. There's a book called a book called Black Sun Rising. It's the first of a trilogy called the Coldfire Trilogy by C.S. Friedman.
Yeah.
C.S. Friedman is really nice, enjoyable writer as well, and so is C.J. Cherry. So like Black Sun Rising and Coldfire Trilogy, very enjoyable fantasy novels.
Yeah, Emily is like super into those.
Awesome.
She's got a bunch of rad fan art.
Yeah, those are great. Yeah. So, next question, Adam. Anything awesome here?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a few. I just don't know how much we have time for.
Yeah. We've got time for 4 minutes more.
Okay. So Nesio Squid asked, "How do you approach sexual orientation for NPCs? Does the setting influence that at all?" Yes and no. It can. Like, there are no gay characters in Star Wars. There just aren't any. There are none. Like, it's a thing that has been said, like, by official people in charge of Star Wars that are just like, yeah, we don't want to talk about that. It's just not a thing. But fuck that, because there's gay people in the universe. So, I mean, I think setting can, and this goes back to what we were talking about before, where people will want the setting to continue to be reflective of the society it's built in, which doesn't generally include like LGBT characters. I don't obviously like that very much. I like being included in stuff. So I tend to be more inclusive than maybe most settings include by default, but we're starting to really see like flagship properties move away from that. Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons are both way more inclusive now than they have ever been before, and include gay and lesbian characters, trans characters, and it's a big deal. And I think that that's a thing we're going to see more and more of as people realize that there is an audience who gives a shit about that kind of diversity. So for me, the setting can try to influence it, but I'm not going to let it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I think like it's kind of similar to the way you can approach race for NPCs as well, right? Like, you sort of have to decide for yourself. Do I care as a creator, as someone who's, being creative? Do I care about raising these issues that these people represent? Or even not, like, do I care about raising the issues, but do I care about making sure that these people feel like they exist in this space? And I think that answer would be different for me depending on whether I'm running a game online or offline. And, it's maybe a little bit crappy, but it actually feels more important to me to represent a broader, more diverse range of characters online, because I know there's way more people watching it and seeing it. So, like, when I'm playing with a group of 3 to 5 people in real life, like, I can be sure to include people like them, and I only have to include 5 people total in my game.
Right.
But when I'm running a game online for an audience and potentially in the thousands or 10,000, like, I'd love to be able to say, for people to come away from watching a session that I'm GMing and say, I saw someone who is kind of like me in Steven's game, and that makes me feel good.
So I mean, this is a topic that we're going to cover, I think, as like a whole show.
Yeah.
Because we really
easily could.
I mean, well, we could, and we really need a guest on the show who's not a white male to help us talk about diversity. So this is a thing that we're only very narrowly able to talk about. So tune in future for that stuff.
Yep, totally. Is there another good quick one we can do right here at the very end?
These ones are all I could ramble. I could go on. So let's
totally.
Anyone who has questions that didn't get them answered, we'll start a Q&A thread over at
I've already got it up.
Look at you go. All right, so there's a thread over at JP's subreddit where we will discuss today's show, and you can ask us questions there, and we're both reasonably good at answering them.
Totally. Well, everybody, thank you so much for coming out and watching us talk about role-playing games. I hope that you found it interesting and useful at your table, whether you're a player or a game master yourself. So, Adam, why don't you tell us who you are and where people can find you and in what capacity they can find you, because I think that's changed a little bit recently.
It sure has, Steven.
Awesome.
Our promotional banter is getting really good. Yes, I am Adam Koebel. The easiest place, and probably the place you already know the most about to see more of me, is as the GM right here on Swan Song and on Mirror Shades. So if you're not already tuning in for those, please do. And if you want more of me just on my lonesome doing stuff, you can follow me on Twitter at skinnyghost is where I tweet from. And I'm now officially a real streamer. I'm a Twitch, whatever they call themselves. So I have some of my own stuff where I do a little bit of this. I play games. I talk about what the games are like, and yeah, you can see that at twitch.tv/Adam Koebel. And I understand that JP is trolling us right now. So
That's
someday in the distant future, JP will know the difference between the two of us. Adam, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Thank you, Stephen. So I am Stephen, and yeah, that's actually me right there, right now. And you can find me on Twitter at Silent Osiris. I stream very occasionally over on twitch.tv/Silent Osiris, but the main place to see me is right here on twitch.tv. You can actually see me tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm sure JP will yell at me if I got that wrong, but I didn't. And that's for the West Marches. And I also work on a game called Warhammer 40,000 Eternal Crusade, so you should definitely check that out if you're into third-person shooter MMO type games. And I think that's all we have for you this evening.
Thanks for coming, everybody, and we'll see you again in a little while.
Yeah, head over to the subreddit because we've got that Q&A up if you have any lingering questions.
Awesome.
Bye, everyone.
Later.